Good evening, New Brunswick, and welcome to Voice of the Province. I'm your host, Mike Gange. Our guests tonight represent nearly 14,000 students on various campuses in New Brunswick. Robert Burrows is the Executive Director of the New Brunswick Student Alliance. Robert, a pleasure to have you. And Sarah Camus is Chair of the Board of Directors of the New Brunswick Student Alliance. Very shortly, we will have our phone lines open and we will welcome your phone calls as always. And tonight, let's start, Robert, with a question for you. You represent about 2% of the population of New Brunswick, 700,000 people roughly in New Brunswick. Why should we be concerned about what students are going through on the campus?
So, thanks for having us tonight. And I think it's important to start off with this kind of a question. You know, why talk about students? Why talk about post-secondary education, especially for a city like Fredericton, where post-secondary education is the lifeblood of our city. I mean, this is the most important.
Well, now hold it. We get the politics too, and we've got a whole bunch of other, but anyway, I get
Absolutely.
your point.
Right. I mean, we're looking at this as a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Right.
Like UNB alone, for example, constitutes almost 5% of our province's GDP. International students, there are only roughly, 2,000 of them here in this province. They bring in almost $200 million in new money to the province every year, year on year. That's thousands of jobs. So it's not just the students necessarily that we're looking at, it's the off-spin, so the research and development. But we always like to say at the NBSA that our greatest asset in New Brunswick is human capital. And that's why we consistently ask government, for the business community, for the general public to listen to our story, to listen to our narrative, to believe in us, because we are the future. You know, the guy that was on the receiving end of a noise complaint maybe last year is now the owner of a software business. So we're not just talking about this cohort of people that live in a bubble. I mean, they very much are a part of our community.
But that's 14,000 of them. Well, I'm wondering, do we have too many kids in university? You represent University of New Brunswick,
Both
Fredericton
campuses.
and St. John, St. Thomas University, Mount Allison University.
Yep.
The University of Moncton, Université de Moncton.
We don't. So we engage with them. They're partners with us.
Right.
We don't represent them anymore at this point. We have opened a dialogue with them to see how, especially in the build up to the next election, we can enhance that cooperation.
Right.
Because it's important that students speak with one voice. And
Okay.
we have. We've done a fairly good job over the past year of ensuring that Francophone, Anglophone, international students across the province are all understanding what it is that their student organizations are speaking about.
Okay. Why don't you represent also the community colleges, for example?
So we actually recently this year approved the application of the New Brunswick College of Craft and Design Student Association's application to be a full member. So they're the first college that we've invited on board. It's a way for us to establish whether or not we can develop the internal capacity to represent them adequately and properly, because that's another thing we have to consider as well. If we're going to take them on board, if they're going to have access to the services that we as an organization and as an alliance offer, we have to be able to do a good job at that. And so this is kind of a nice little test for us to go, can we talk the language of colleges? And you know, in our report that we recently released on the state of student affairs, last November when we sat with the Lieutenant Governor, she challenged us. She said, you know, look, you've got to look at the colleges, NBCC, CCMB, and go, what are we missing?
And she thinks like I do.
She does indeed, and actually, I spoke with one of the vice presidents at NBCC. So we were at the Fredericton Chambers parliamentary breakfast with Matt DeCourcy, and in it he spoke about education. And
just
recently this week.
Yes.
And so I was speaking with one of the vice presidents from NBCC about the need for further collaboration between the colleges and the NBSA and their student associations as well.
What reaction do you get from the politicians
about bringing colleges on board?
Right. Or about your concerns in general?
You know, I think that the NBSA has put in a lot of good work over the past couple of years, and our organization, like all other organizations, has had its ups and downs. And over the past 3 years, we've had a concerted effort to develop our internal policy making process. So ensuring that when we go to government, we're not just going to them and saying, this is what we would like. No, we've gone to them, we've spoken to our membership, we've done the research, we've studied what the economic impact of this is, understanding that governments today are working with very limited, one could say, resources, especially financial resources. And they've understood that, or they understand that we've done all that work. And so we're not just going to them willy-nilly. You know, we're saying, look, this is an important thing for students. This is how we're going to help students integrate into our community better and to prosper better. And at the end of the day, we believe, and this is something we've said publicly as well, investments in post-secondary education are the best investment for New Brunswick's future.
So I come back to my question again. Are there too many kids on campuses? Do we have too many universities here? Are there 14 or 15 in the Maritimes altogether? And here we've just named 5 of them.
Right.
Are there too many kids on campus?
See, there's the official response, and then there's the personal response. And whenever I get asked these questions, I'm always tempted to say, why is it so bad that we have an educated society? Why is it so bad that we have, when we include the University of Moncton, almost 20,000 university students from undergrad all the way through to the graduate level who are learning how to read, think, and write? How is that so bad for New Brunswick? And I would say that it's not. It's actually, that's how New Brunswick at some point is going to pull itself out of whatever economic situation and whatever demographic crisis awaits us.
How so?
Well, in theory, the more educated society, the more economically advanced the society, the more technologically advanced, the more integrated our communities can be.
Right.
And so our membership, for the most part, are liberal arts students, right? And that's something it can be hard to explain that to the general public. STEM students, so the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, it's a little bit easier. They correlate to a job on the other end.
Right.
College students as well, they correlate to a job on the other end.
Right.
Whereas liberal arts students, their degrees don't necessarily lead into something right on the other end. A history student doesn't necessarily become a historian.
Right.
But a history student has soft skills that they can walk out with, and these soft skills are important. Right? Like that's what's going to help New Brunswick. So it's people who know how to read and write. We just hired a history student ourselves at the Alliance for the summer through the Canada Summer Job Grant. And one of the attractions of that student that we hired was that they know how to read, they know how to write, they know how to do research. We don't have to worry about these things. Those are the easy things that employers I don't have to spell check after them, right? And when you look at the kind of perceived skills gap that a lot of employers tend to raise concerns about, we have a very good working relationship with the Fredericton Chamber, and so through that we can talk to business owners in the business community, and they say, Rob, like, we need certain skills. And I go, well, are they technical skills? Is this the stuff where they just have to learn the software, learn the technology? And a lot of them go, no, that's easy. We can teach that. We can train that. It's can they time manage? It's can they critically think? It's can they write a report to me? Can they go to a conference, understand what's being said, come back and write a one-page brief so that our board or our senior leadership or our management understands what it is that they're talking about? And if you're missing that, you're going to end up with what we necessarily have or could have, which is vast majority of underemployment. So we complain about the English majors working as a barista, right? We complain about that. Well, if we're not valuing the kinds of skills that these English majors are coming out as, then yes, the labor market will naturally say, well, you don't have skills that we value. And then on the flip side, the employers are saying, well, how come we don't have students who know how to read and write? So there is a little bit of
at a critical thinking level, not at the basic literacy.
No, exactly,
Right.
Not basic literacy. But I mean, even then, this government has spoken about it, and the Minister of Finance, who's also responsible for literacy, she's mentioned this. Our literacy rates could be a lot better in New Brunswick. And that feeds into certain things like civic discourse, that feeds into certain things like wealth accumulation, job creation, cultural enhancement, all sorts of things that are good for a society and for communities.
You have about 14,000 people that you represent on the various campuses. And one of the complaints that my generation often hears is that while the kids are learning critical thinking, they aren't necessarily being groomed as entrepreneurs, where they might start their own business and invest in time and management and growth here in New Brunswick.
Right.
So how do you address that?
Well, and this is always the challenge talking, when I talk to my parents, for example, it's very much the same thing. When my parents were coming through and coming of age, like I was, there were certain jobs you could or could not take, right? A university degree allowed you to do this, or a university degree didn't allow you to do that. Whereas now, I think you'll find with our generation, and certainly, I mean, you're in the fine arts, so you would understand this as well. Students graduate and they say, well, if there's no job for me, I'll make a job, right? There's an aspect or a niche component of the market that is missing. I will go in there and I will tackle that problem and I'll challenge that problem. Where we're having conversations right now with government is how do we get them from I've got the idea to this is what I want to do, or this is how I actually address and solve a problem. So there are institutes, for example, at University of New Brunswick, for example, the TMEs, the Technology Management and Entrepreneurship, I think, program where they have their summer institute right now that helps young entrepreneurs get from there to there, which is very important. The other thing too to understand is and we try to stress this, especially with our engineering students. At some point, engineers stop becoming engineers, or sorry, stop being engineers. They become managers, and that kind of, as you were saying, time management, leadership, managerial expertise, we tend to take that for granted. It's a lot easier for a liberal arts student who's looking for experiential learning opportunities and saying, ooh, I need a job, like it's not history related, but I'm learning about how to be a manager. I've taken that summer job at the park, but hey, I'm responsible for 20 people. Ensuring that they get paid on time, ensuring that their leave is accounted for.
So it's not what you do there, it's what you learn while you're there.
Exactly. And this is, we've had a lot of, and certainly I've expressed this to government as well, and this fascination with productive programs. As if a university program that doesn't lead directly to a job explicitly correlated to that field of study is no longer a valuable program for a university or for a society.
Right.
And I would take the approach, and we would certainly take the approach that it's not a good mark of a healthy society to simply judge its citizenry or based on their economic output and their economic value. It's why we don't tend to use the terminology taxpayer, right? Because not everybody in New Brunswick pays tax. Certainly, a lot of our members don't. If you're a full-time student, you're technically not considered part of the labor force. And yet, do we get counted? Are we allowed to have policy made for us? Are we allowed to have supports for us, given that at one point we will become part of the labor force? So it's those kinds of conversations that we're hoping to, you nudge them along, and we're slowly getting there, slowly trying to get governments and politicians and decision makers to listen to us on that front.
Right. Our guests tonight, ladies and gentlemen, are Robert Burrows. He's the Executive Director of the New Brunswick Student Alliance, and Sarah Camus. She's Chair of the Board of Directors of the New Brunswick Student Alliance. So Sarah, let's turn to you as a young woman. One of the things that concerns me, as a dad, as somebody on the university campus, and certainly representative of an enlightened society, is the sexual imbalance, and we see it even from the President of the United States and his mistreatment of women. And so how do you address that as a young, educated woman in New Brunswick?
Yeah, absolutely. This is, sexual assault, sexual harassment is a big topic and big issue on our campus. And it's systemic, and it's happening sort of behind doors. 9 out of 10 cases of sexual assault are against women. And we also see it being a very intersectional issue. I
don't know what that means.
Intersectional meaning certain factors of someone's life might intersect. So we see Aboriginal women are 3 times more likely to be affected by sexual assault. 83% of women with disabilities are more likely to experience violence throughout their life. So we're seeing that this is an intersectional issue, and also that sexual assault can take form at a macro and a micro level. So again, you
need to explain that.
I will. At a macro level, we see Donald Trump. We see it in the media. We hear about rapes happening on campus. That is a huge issue. But we also see it at a micro level. We see it, when we're at our student pubs and people are, mostly men, touching women unwanted. They're making unwanted advances, things like touching you in places you don't want to be, simply as they walk past you in the bar. So there are also these smaller microaggressions that we're
I don't
seeing
think
happen.
that's changed from the time I walked on the campus. I really don't. I think that women have just got more vocal about it, and that the numbers maybe are now being more reported. What do you think?
I think that's a great point. I think that is starting the conversation, and it starts with a few really brave people opening up about their experiences. And one person might hear that story, that conversation starting, and say, hey, like, I experienced that too. So it sort of is a snowball effect where women are becoming more comfortable talking about this issue. We see that also happening with mental health on our campus.
Are the two linked?
They can be, for sure.
Right. It can certainly be a life-changing
Yeah, it can be a very traumatic experience.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Because you touched on mental health, and I certainly wanted to come back to that. In our enlightened society, are we getting better? Are males getting better about our mistreatment of women?
I think so. Although there are still certain cultures that exist, we do see sort of hyper-masculine cultures that exist within our campuses.
And so where would those pockets be? In my mind, right away comes the sports teams, right? That might be one of them. Maybe in certain professions.
Yes.
Dalhousie had that terrible incident in the dentistry school a little while ago, and I'm thinking that might not be exclusive to Dalhousie.
You're right.
Where else?
You're pretty bang on. Especially where there is, a group of individuals who feel it's okay to act in certain ways, and so when there are new individuals who come into that group, they look up to the upper year students and start to mimic or mirror behaviors that they see. And that's where the culture becomes perpetuated, especially where, you mentioned sports teams. You spend so much time together. Varsity sports are a huge aspect of your life if you play them. And so, of course, the people you're around are going to influence the way you behave.
So how can we get, then, those cultures to change?
Well, that's something that we're looking at, especially in our orientation week this year. We have a wonderful advisor on campus, Melody Petlock.
Here on
the Mount Allison campus.
I see.
And every year she does a sort of a training or talk with each varsity sports team. Now we're also looking into potentially getting speakers come in and also do those sorts of talks where we could bring in potentially somebody from the sports sphere to give those types of talks. Somebody that a varsity athlete might relate to better. So
that's all a good beginning, isn't it?
We're
just about out of time for this segment, Sarah, and we're going to come back to that. Our guests today, Robert Burrows and Sarah Camus, and we'll be back in a moment with Voice of the Province. Sarah, we had this nice conversation about progress in our society. Let's turn to you, Robert. Are we making progress, do you think, in sexual assaults on campus? What else can we do about this?
I think it's sexual assault on campus is particularly tricky because our campuses, for the most part, are very integrated into our communities. And so it's not like sexual assault only happens on campus and then it doesn't happen in the community.
True.
Right? So these are conversations that student unions across the province are starting to have with, for example, bar owners in downtown cities. They're starting to have with the judiciary. For example, we know that there's a private member's bill in Ottawa right now that will, I presume, in the fall be before the House of Commons and before the Senate, talking about the need for judges who deal with sexual assault cases through their courts to receive training on sexual assault so they can adequately come to determinations.
There have been a couple of these high-profile cases, haven't there?
Indeed, and when you think of
where was one of them in Nova Scotia?
I'm thinking about the one in Nova Scotia, not so long ago, quite recently.
That was the young woman who was the passenger in the taxi,
indeed,
and assaulted by the taxi driver.
The taxi driver, indeed.
But the judge said
the judge effectively acquitted him.
Right.
Said no, not found guilty. I believe the wording was that no, it was possible for her to have given consent.
Right.
And it's frustrating as a young man in the society and of our membership and of post-secondary across the country, and I think across the world, you'll see that it's overwhelmingly women that we represent. Right? Young women are our membership. And so it's how do I explain to my membership then that no, we've got everything in place. We've done all the consent training. We've done all the yes means yes and the no means no. We've banned everybody from the pubs. We've expelled all the students, and yet when it gets to the highest court in a criminal proceeding, a judge can say, actually, everything you've learned about consent, I don't agree with and I don't believe in.
That also happened, I think, in Alberta in the court case there, didn't they? The judge was overturned ultimately, I think, on appeal.
Yes. It's not the first time this has happened. This is a repeated pattern, and much like a lot of the cases that we see when it comes to sexual misconduct, sexual violence, and sexual harassment, patterns emerge. There is a responsibility, certainly we're speaking as an alliance to the young men that we represent and saying, you absolutely do have a responsibility to take charge of this situation and to understand where it is that you make your classmates and the other people in your community feel uncomfortable. Because we would, the board has made this a priority this year in terms of coming up with a strategy to help universities and colleges in this province deal with sexual assault and harassment on our campuses. The MBSA would certainly say that given, again, the overwhelming majority of our members who are women, and given that the overwhelming majority of survivors when it comes to sexual assault are women, that this is a fundamental access issue. If government and the post-secondary institutions cannot guarantee the physical safety of our membership, that to us is an access issue. And when we look at the MBSA's mandate, which is accessible, affordable, high-quality post-secondary education, this ranks top. It would be what we would consider part of the big three problems that the post-secondary sector just can't quite seem to address. So in addition to sexual assault, mental health, and then also indigenizing indigenizing the academy. And certainly, as Sarah said previously, earlier in the last segment, these can be interlinked. That's
Right.
part of the idea of intersectionality, when the different demographic profiles start to link, and we start seeing certain profiles are more likely to be on the receiving end of not so pleasant things.
I was a university student in the 70s, and we rarely heard of anyone who suffered from a mental health issue. We certainly didn't recognize it as an illness. Mm-hmm. Are you seeing that as an increase in trends on campuses now?
Certainly something that, and Sarah's been a lead on this in terms of the organization dealing with the mental health file. For us, one of the things we've noticed, because the student movement has been so involved, is certainly at the leadership of it, is when it comes to mental health and mental health related problems, literacy has really been the key mandate of a lot of student organizations. So like ours and our counterparts in different provinces and in Ottawa, we've dealt with how do we better understand our mental health? Mm-hmm. Are there challenges? Do we know whether this is simply stress related, or do we know whether this is indeed a mental illness? What is the difference?
Is it more stressful today to be on campus, do you think?
I would certainly say so.
And that would be because of jobs, maybe?
One of them would be,
so many kids are trying to hold down a full-time job while they're going to school?
When you have a Minister of Finance at the federal level that says that precarious work should be the norm, or can be expected to be the norm for young people, certainly that's something that weighs on our membership.
Right.
High debt levels.
Right. And these are societal changes mm-hmm. that are not reflected in your parents' generation, right? They worked and tuition was $600 a year to go.
Right.
Versus $7,000 now.
Right. Yes, indeed. I had someone close to my dad's age who mentioned the other day. We had an entire generation of young men come back from war. Right. And yet we don't have the same. We didn't have the same kind of mental health prevalence on those campuses as we do now. What gives?
Yes.
Why can a generation go to war, come back, and be fine, and yet this generation that, for the most part, hasn't seen.
And they weren't all fine, but they were told, "Suck it up."
Well, and this is the thing. You have now a generation of people who, in the U.S. and I guess across the world, they've been identified as snowflakes. Well, our membership is looking and saying we understand our bodies better. We understand the impact of certain environmental stressors or indicators that would affect our mental health. We want to be healthier. We want to be able to contribute to our societies in meaningful ways. Mm-hmm. We can't do that if we're not mentally well. And I think that this generation being so aware and literate about their mental health has put additional strains on public sectors such as the education sector and the health sector. Mm-hmm. Because the demand is there, but the ability to service that demand simply isn't there. We look at in our advocacy document last year when we mentioned what would it take to get New Brunswick's spending on mental health up to the national average of 9% of health budgets. It would take $130 million to get there, right? A 5% increase in our health budget. So we asked government, we said, look, if you're serious about this, over the next 5 years, you should commit to increasing 1% a year of the health budget to mental health every year until then.
I'm dying to know. What did he say?
I think it's useful for us that the Minister of Post-Secondary Education, Minister Arsenault, has actually, he's come to us and said, I didn't realize it was such a big issue. I didn't realize that this was something that really was a problem for students, and yet now he recognizes, government recognizes, politicians are recognizing. We've spoken with the opposition as well, and their caucus has come to us and said, how can we help you? How can we help ensure that government is doing their due diligence to students? So we saw a modest increase to the mental health budget in the last budget. That was specifically designed for the integrated service delivery unit. So those are the community-based and family-oriented mental health service teams. There's a gap. In theory, that will address a lot of the mental illnesses from K to 12, one could say.
Right.
Where we have the gap is when they get to post-secondary, where we know that prevalence rates are higher, when we know that incidence rates are higher, when we know that that's where all the major stressors kick in.
Right.
And we're seeing that funding gap when it comes to resources. So
right.
we anticipate, or we estimate, that we would actually need to increase the number of full-time mental health counselors on our public university campuses by 50% to meet the bare minimum ratio of what would be an appropriate ratio.
Right.
Yeah.
We certainly live in a changing world, and one of the things that we're seeing in the workplace, on the college campuses, and probably in public schools as well, are gender neutral bathrooms. It seems like such an easy solution. Mm-hmm. And yet you're meeting some pushback on this when you talk about it to people beyond your student alliance.
You'd be surprised. It seems like a very straightforward issue. And this is something, as chair of the board, Sarah has made this a priority for me as staff for the Alliance to ensure that this comes through. We've met with government. We've seen some pretty major changes in terms of legislation. So New Brunswick has amended its Human Rights Act to provide protections against discrimination on the basis of gender.
Did you play a part in that?
We had expressed our desire for that to happen.
Right.
Certainly this year, 2017, being the 50th anniversary of New Brunswick's Human Rights Act, that had been something that we were talking to government about. We've also seen changes through Bill C-16, which just recently, I believe last week or the week before, received royal assent. So that would have changed the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code for the same provisions or comparable provisions. So we're looking at the legislation is now there, and it's ironic that the struggle we now come up against is, well, the building code in certain buildings requires gendered bathrooms, which you would think that, well, you don't have a gendered bathroom in your house. You
right.
have a gender-neutral bathroom in your house. Why at certain public institutions would we have? And really, when it comes to bathrooms, these are similar conversations that are happening across different jurisdictions, and we would certainly agree in the sense that this isn't really a conversation about bathrooms. This is a conversation about access, right? Especially our institutions where we represent students at public institutions. So our members should be able to have access to public facilities at public institutions. That should be the bare minimum when it comes to accessibility in terms of the physical structure of our campuses. And so that's what we're talking about.
Let's go to Sarah. You've done a lot of research on this and you're nodding your head. What kinds of pushbacks have you had on or heard of in some of this as an agenda for the Student Alliance?
I think Rob pretty well covered it. I was nodding in agreement. But yeah, there was a little bit of pushback. However, for the amendment or adjustment to the building code really doesn't seem that challenging to do. It's one clause. And so what we're seeing right now on our campus at Mount Allison is we have some gender-neutral washrooms, but they're single occupancy, so they are what you would see in your own home. Mm-hmm. We see in some residences some gender-neutral washrooms, but when it's a case of slapping a new sign on the door, what is the issue? Why not? When it comes down to safety, accessibility, comfortability, why not?
All part of our changing society.
Mm.
Do we need to educate the engineers then on this? They're the ones that are building the buildings.
I wouldn't say it's that. The decision makers, I think, are the ones that we need to be talking to. When you plan a new building, why are you not building gender-neutral bathrooms? Mm-hmm. How can you have government office space that doesn't accommodate civil servants or members of the public or employees that don't fall into a binary when it comes to gender in terms of pre-described or prescribed gender.
Let's go to a hockey game.
Mhm.
There's 2,000 people at the hockey game. Maybe 1,000 of them, 1,200 of them are males. 800 of them, because I'm generalizing that perhaps there are fewer women at this game. There seems to be no problem. There's washrooms. There's barely enough washrooms to accommodate the crowd in the 20-minute intermission that we've got between periods.
Right.
But what about transgenders, and what about people who are not comfortable in public, and how does a hockey rink then have to accommodate them, and for accessibility was the word you used, Robert.
Right.
I'm asking. I don't know.
If a transgender individual doesn't feel comfortable using a gendered washroom, chances are they end up not using the washroom. And I think we've all been in public where we've needed to use the washroom and one has not been available to us. Why should anyone be in that situation?
I don't know.
No, exactly. So
what do we need to do with these hockey rinks?
Gender neutral bathrooms, or build more bathrooms for that matter.
Right. But the building's been there for 20 or 40 years. This may be a little bit of a...
It's a public space, isn't it?
Right. I don't disagree with you.
Yeah,
I'm only asking for illumination.
Yeah, I mean, it's the one where I think that, you know, we tend to, our generation, and certainly in these kinds of questions, can come off a little bit snotty, because to us, so it's been there for 40 years, right? Like at some point you're going to do infrastructure upgrades. Why have you not, and again, we fixate on the idea of the bathroom. The bathroom is one component of it. You know, it's one place. We're talking about access to public spaces, really is what it is. So if you're saying, no, we actually don't want you to have access to this particular space, you're limiting that person's ability to access public spaces. And we use this on campus, you know, why should a transgender student have to go to a different building to use the bathroom?
Right.
That to us makes no sense.
Right.
And so when we go to universities and say, look, there are models for this across the world. There's a way that we can do this that isn't so antiquated, and we don't really buy the argument anymore that, well, the infrastructure's old. All of our infrastructure's old. I mean, when you look at university campuses across, yes, we're building new buildings, but deferred maintenance over the past decade has been awful for public post-secondary institutions here in the province. That's no longer an argument. And I think that, you know, it goes back to the mental health question of, you have students now, those that access education, that are smarter, that are more literate, that are more articulate, that demand more of their institutions, that say that, yeah, maybe the status quo worked before, but it doesn't work for us anymore, and we're expecting more of you. And I don't think that it's unfair for our membership to expect more of government, of their institutions, of their communities, that they contribute a lot to, be it culturally, be it financially, be it economically. I think that's a very fair approach for our members to take.
Now, you said this is an accessibility issue. And so let's extend this beyond washrooms to accessibility to people who might have disabilities that make them unable to climb stairs,
right,
or have access to this public space. What is your organization doing to address those issues?
So we've actually, and Sarah, you're one of the leads on this one, so perhaps you want to touch on that. We've identified physical accessibility as one of our priorities for the year. We do have a standing policy on it.
What is it?
Our standing policies, the hope is that by 2020, all public institutions in New Brunswick will have fully physically accessible buildings. So this includes, I mean, the bare minimum when it comes to ensuring that there's braille in the elevators, for example, ensuring that there are ramps up the stairs, ensuring that they're up to building code when it comes to, can someone in a wheelchair or in crutches or with any other physical impairment get into a building and get to class. Those are the kind of bare minimums, and I know that Sarah with her committee has been looking to expand that definition. So it's a constant challenge of how do we continue to expand to ensure that we don't just get the easy win and then move on.
When we talk about,
So let me just cut you off, because we're almost out of time for this segment. This is obviously an area where you're passionate about and making some big changes, and we'll come back and talk about that in just a moment. You're joining us, ladies and gentlemen, on Voice of the Province. I'm Mike Gange. My guests, Robert Burrows and Sarah Camus, and we'll be back in a second. Well, we're talking about some of the changes that we're seeing on campus. Is there, obviously there is, why is there a need for a unified voice from students today? Robert, let's go to you on that.
Sure. We touched on this right at the top of the show. The idea that we are a transient or insignificant cohort in the population it's not good for our community to do that. Given the way that we're so integrated, given the way that the population and government and politicians and decision makers are scrambling to try and keep young people in the province, it really is important to start taking students seriously.
Now, do you represent the 17-year-old kid that is right out of high school and starting first year university, and the PhD students that are working on something, or the law students, maybe others in grad schools?
So it depends on the membership of our member unions.
Right.
So we represent the student unions, and not all of them represent graduate students.
Right.
Some of them represent law students. So at UNB here in Fredericton, their student union represents all the undergraduate law students. But it's given that we are the largest student organization in New Brunswick, we do feel that we have a responsibility to address the whole package when it comes to the education sector. So we will help government and consult with government on issues that may touch incoming students. When it comes to issues such as the free tuition program, formerly TAB, the Tuition Access Bursary, and it's we call it the sliding scale, so the tuition relief for the middle class, the add-on there. The kinds of students we should be targeting are grade 10 students, grade 11 students. Looking at them and saying, where are your barriers when it comes to access? Where are your financial barriers when it comes to education? Let us alleviate some of those problems, but if we're not convincing them to take advantage of this program, then I don't know that the program fulfills its potential. So that's kind of where we go in terms of outside the traditional scope of an 18 to 24-year-old. Likewise, we speak with government on programs like the timely completion benefit, which is a debt relief program for graduates. So we don't represent graduates and recent graduates, but our members will eventually become recent graduates, the same way that high school students will in theory eventually become our members. So we do deal with issues that are on either end of the spectrum, trying to help government and decision makers in the province understand that education is a spectrum when we talk about student issues. Some things are up front, some things are at the tail end, and a lot of things are in the middle. And if we just attack one point and go, yeah, it was good enough for this year and we're done, you don't actually end up addressing the whole picture. And it's important to see the whole picture. So when we look at, okay, what is the FTPs, this free tuition program, and internally we call the tuition relief for the middle class, TARMAC. So when we look at that suite of programs, so we're looking to get, in theory, an influx of lower income and first generation students into our university systems, right? So these are students for which the academy has not been designed and not been built, right? So now you've got students that are not what we consider traditional students into an environment that thrives on traditional students. Where then, you look at universities are now considering, okay, how do we realign or profile certain supports that are necessary for these students? When we look at changes to the way that New Brunswick has done its student loan assessment, in terms of the fixed contribution, just aligning with the federal changes, self-identified Indigenous students are now exempt from any contribution to the loan program. So if we're inviting a whole bunch of Indigenous students to university campuses at a time when we're, resistance and reconciliation are the top two things that we're talking about on campus when it comes to this issue, are the supports there? When they look around their campus, do they see visual representation that this is their community? Do we continue to acknowledge that this is indeed on unceded treaty land? Do we allow them to speak their language? Do we allow them to have their spaces of gathering, of ceremony, of worship?
And so are you being successful in this endeavor, specifically for First Nations peoples?
This is a conversation that the MBSA started internally last year. We noticed specifically when it came to TAB, for example, or the previous iteration of the free tuition program, that it should, in theory, be eligible for a whole swath of First Nations students and Indigenous students. What we realized afterwards was that it wasn't clear whether or not we had spoken to chiefs and to certain bands and to Indigenous students that are part of our membership. It wasn't inherently clear that this program was also available to them. And so that kind of helped kickstart a much broader internal conversation when it came to we as a post-secondary sector have a very clear obligation to respond to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. I mean, there's a whole section in there on education. And as a key stakeholder in that sector, the NBSA, we have a moral duty to respond. And so this year we started, we have an open dialogue with the Mi'kmaq Wolastoqey Center here at the University of New Brunswick. We speak with our Indigenous counselors on campus up at St. Thomas. We have an elder in residence there that we engage with, and also the Indigenous coordinator at Mount Allison, to ensure that as we move forward, can we build a multi-year, and we've identified this in our annual plan, a multi-year strategy to help us as a student movement address the needs of our membership.
Are we seeing then more First Nations people coming to campus? Like there's the hard facts. Is it working?
Well, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I don't know if the stats are there yet. Mount Allison recently hosted sort of an Indigenous Day where there was a lot of high school students, Indigenous high school students from the area who came to Mount Allison, who are very, very excited to see what Mount Allison had planned. Things like we're having the discussion about having an Indigenous Studies minor. We're having the discussion on, okay, we need to have more Indigenous scholars in our faculty. Okay, something we've talked about is hanging the Mi'kmaq flag on campus all year round. Those discussions are happening, and we fully support them.
Mm-hmm. This is a time when a lot of students are out looking for summer jobs, and we in New Brunswick have had the SEED program, and I can't remember what the acronym is.
Summer Employment Experience Development, I think it is. Yeah.
Right, and part of the complaint about that program is that it's very closely guarded by the MLAs, and that if you don't have a tie to that political person, you might not be someone who ends up with a summer job. How do you feel about that?
So this was our concern 2 years ago. Our concern was that this was very much the case, and I'll be honest. When I was a student at Mount Allison several years ago, our MLA was in the government, and so there were lots of jobs for students. But you play that you take that gamble. And what we had said as an organization to government is that this is not fair. It simply isn't fair that this is how we distribute it. And so we said, look, you've got to get the politics out of this thing. And so step one last year was the first iteration where they got rid of the politics. It no longer was the MLA or the riding-based distribution. This was by region. And so the service delivery regions that Service New Brunswick has developed and is used by government. And we were happy with that. Where we weren't happy was the way that those jobs are distributed, right? So they introduced a voucher program last year. And it's always one where I say to government, and I think...
But again, to get the voucher, you have to know the MLA.
But you don't.
Okay.
Yeah, so you used to, the employer, it used to be employer driven.
Right.
And so what happened last year was, and we had been saying this to government, over and over, you got to get the onus out of the employer's hand and into the student's hands, because this is effectively a student employment and student experience development program, not a business subsidy.
Right.
Right, and so that for us was our priority. Get it into the hands of the students, because students can then use this as a work experience opportunity, an experiential learning opportunity. You need those soft skills, like you said, time management, leadership, organization, all those. You can do that using this. The downside was there's no perfect delivery system for these vouchers, right? Last year it was a first come, first serve, which we determined it didn't work. And there were other complications with the rollout of the whole voucher program and whatnot. So government approached us several months ago and said, look, we'd like to do a random draw.
So when you say government, do you mean the Premier?
PEDAL. The Department of Post-Secondary Education, Training and Labor.
Okay.
So this is the department responsible for universities and for jobs and training. Right. And so the civil service and the senior leadership of the civil service came to us and said, look, we have, you've consulted with us on SEED before, and you've made recommendations to the SEED program before, and absolutely we'd like to hear your feedback. And so we said last year didn't work. We needed a new way. And they proposed a random draw. And we said, okay, look, a couple of thoughts. The first of which is a perception issue, right? And that's always going to be an issue in New Brunswick. It's the perception issue. How do we guarantee that this draw is indeed not one where, like, you were number 51 out of 50, but you called up your MLA and the MLA got you that 51st voucher? So how do we guarantee that this draw is completely intamperable? And one proposal was that the MBSA be a validator of this draw.
I see. So they're listening.
They are listening, and we are now validators of the draw. So we are there to indeed affirm that this draw is a completely randomized process. And again, not ideal, but in the absence of a better solution, this is the best that we have right now, and it works. You know, we're
So
putting
that takes the political party colors out of the draw.
entirely out of the draw. This takes
Right.
any political interference out of the draw.
And that's good for the students.
It's good for the students.
Are there enough jobs for students?
You know, it's always a conversation we have with the department. You know, we always say, hey, we'd love more jobs. And they go, yes, wouldn't we all? But it's a matter of finding resources and allocating those resources that are finite and limited. So right now we've got about 1,700 jobs through the SEED program. There's another 300 to 400 jobs when it comes to for the parks, the tourism information centers, those small organizations. And they got another 3,000 jobs that are provided by the federal government or that are funded by the federal government. So a total of 5,000 jobs for students here in New Brunswick.
But you said you represent 14,000 people.
We do. Would it be grand if there was a job for every student in New Brunswick all the time? Yes. When it comes to, you know, we're looking at a finite budget, are there more efficient ways that we can help government assess where to profile that money? That's a conversation we continue to have.
Do you think the tuition is a factor? I told you my generation paid $612
Right.
to go to school in 40 years ago. And now it's $7,000 a year to go.
Mount Allison will probably be 8,000 next year, or break 8,000 next year.
That's
Yeah.
hard. You can't possibly, you know, my generation could earn that money May, June, July, and August working at whatever. You can't possibly earn $8,000 and have enough money for your apartment or for your food plan or for your housing or
It's hard,
books.
you know. I mean, we have a summer student. We know how much these summer job grants are. At minimum wage at $11 an hour, working 37 and a half hours a week for 8 weeks, you're looking at $3,000, $3,500, $3,700, somewhere in there.
Right.
So half of what the average tuition is in New Brunswick. Which is not to say that tuition is the be-all and end-all, and that's something that we've identified as a need for our organization to move away from. It's very easy when we talk about the cost of education to simply say tuition is going up. We also know tuition is less than half the cost of the total education package.
Okay, do tell. How so?
Well, I mean, you look at loans expenditure, how much people are taking out of RESPs. We have a general sense of what that is in terms of when you take into consideration books, housing, food, other expenses.
And books have skyrocketed.
Books have absolutely skyrocketed. UNB, but their student union, both here in Fredericton and in St. John, did a campaign last year called Text Broke, simply as an information gathering. How much are you spending? You know, take a copy of your receipts, take a photo of your receipts, send it to us. Let us do thousands of dollars. So an average student spends thousands of dollars on textbooks, and yet we're arguing over that tuition increase. So the extra 2-3% increase in tuition is less than a fraction of that. Whereas now we've got thousands of dollars that, well, we have models for open education resources. Or like in British Columbia, there is one unified Bio 101 textbook. This is the course model. Why is there a need for X number of different Biology 101 classes in New Brunswick?
So the argument on the other hand is going to be that's going to take away from academic freedom or the willingness to investigate something that might be more specific to a course needs and a local needs.
Right.
Whales, for example, on the west or east coast versus agriculture and biological things
Right.
on the prairies or in the woodlands.
Absolutely.
So how do you address that?
Well, so I mean, you're getting professors involved across the province to build these resources, right? It's
Right.
not just someone out of nowhere produces a textbook and says, yeah, this is the new textbook for Bio 101 in New Brunswick. No,
Right.
it is we're engaging the academic community to try and go, is there consensus on what a first-year introduction biology student needs to have coming out of the course?
Right.
And I think that those course outcomes should be fairly standardized across and should be available to the public and on the public record so that we can evaluate. Now, in the upper year courses, we can certainly see that we're going to get some variation. You know,
Right.
you should be able to study
So
what's going on.
Before we run out of time, you also said so textbooks, housing would be a big factor for
Affordable
students.
housing is a big factor for students.
Meals. What
Food.
else?
I mean, those are the big three when it comes to it.
And then transportation.
Yeah, it's another huge thing. You know, you've got two campuses up on the top of the hill here. St. John is not in downtown Fredericton, and you'll need a bus to get up there. Here in Fredericton, for example, there's no buses on Sunday, so that poses a problem if you need to get up to campus on Sunday and you live downtown. Certainly from a Sackville perspective, and Sarah, you can certainly speak to this. I mean, Sackville, where's the public transportation to get to Moncton or Amherst?
And also the percentage of students who are actually from Sackville is very, very low. So you see most students at Mount Allison are not from Sackville. So there is a travel fee, whether that's close or far. And another cost relates to experiential learning. Costs that are not explicit in this experiential learning opportunity.
Can you
So for instance,
quickly tell me what that means?
for instance, like a nursing student, if they're going to the hospital, like parking passes, things like that are costly but not explicit, and they add up so fast.
Right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you've been joining us tonight on Voice of the Province. We could continue this conversation for a long time. And thank you very much to our guests, Robert Burrows, who's the Executive Director of the New Brunswick Student Alliance, and Sarah Camus, who is the chair of the board of directors of the New Brunswick Student Alliance. Big, big issues, and we face a lot of big challenges. And thank you for all of the hard work that you're doing in addressing and teaching my generation how to do this much better.
Thanks for giving us
It's been
the
a pleasure to
opportunity.
have you here. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We'll see you soon.